Hey guys, it's Prince Asbel. A couple Sundays back, I was on a show called The Council of Google+, wherein we informally debated the issue of husbands who are addicted to pornography and whether or not their frigid wives share some of the blame when their husbands look at porn. It's a very unusual subject to debate, but I wanted to do it because there's a problem within the Christian church today. Men are unfairly judged all the time, including married men, for looking at pornography, even those who are stuck with a frigid wife. According to most Christians today, even if a wife only has sex with her husband once a month or ever, quite frankly, then it can't be blamed for when her husband looks at porn. She can't be touched by that. I take extreme exception to that, as I think the Bible takes extreme exception to that, so I decided I wanted to go and debate this issue on their platform. Why? Because the Council of Google Plus is a Bible show, but it's on the same network as another podcast called Theology Gals. And the Theology Gals, they interviewed a lady named Vicky Titi, and she was giving certain tips on what women should do when their husbands look at porn, and the advice she was giving was just, it was so bad. It was so bad, I decided I wanted to talk to the Council of Google Plus because they're a very open and informal show, and I wanted to know, hey, would you guys have me on as a guest so I could voice my disagreements to their audiences directly, since their audiences would overlap at least a little bit. And thankfully, the council was generous and granted me my request. The discussion lasted over 3 hours, and the link will be in the description below, and today we're going to do a review of it. We'll start with a clip from the Theology Gals podcast that started this whole thing in the first place.
I think that is the number one feeling that a woman has when she finds out, is that I must not have been enough. Must not have been appealing enough. I'm not thin enough. I'm not attractive enough. I am not performing well enough in the bedroom. I'm not, or often enough, or whatever. I'm just not enough. And I can't say strongly enough that this is not your fault. This is absolutely not your fault. In the end, we are all responsible for ourselves and how we walk in obedience to God's word, or we don't. And we can't control anyone else's choices but our own. We certainly can't control our husband's choices. And this has nothing to do with the size of her jeans or her bra size or how often she's being intimate.
Now that right there is a perfect example of feminism within Christianity. The woman is the victim no matter what. It has nothing to do with her weight, her performance in the bedroom, or how often she has sex with her husband. There can be no possibility that the wife is at fault. If her husband looks at porn, he's the only one to blame, period, full stop. That is not what the Bible teaches, which might explain why there was little to no Bible cited in that interview in the first place. The Bible not only doesn't teach it, it teaches expressly against it in 1 Corinthians 7 verse 5, wherein married men and women are told to have sex with each other to avoid the temptation to commit sexual sin. So, when Vicky Titi tells wives that it doesn't matter how often you had sex with your husband, it has nothing to do with whether he's going to look at pornography, she's just plain wrong. She's contradicting what scripture says. That's what formed the basis of like 90% of my contentions with that podcast. And at first I tried hashing this out on the Bible Thumping Wingnut Facebook page, but inevitably you get dogpiled or you get censored by people blocking you, which included Colleen, the co-host of Theology Gals, the lady who was interviewing Vicky Titi. I debated with Colleen, and she blocked me and effectively ended our discussion. It was on her thread, so if she blocks me, I can't post any more comments or even see the thread. Now, I haven't blocked her, and I didn't ask the council members to keep her out of the debate. In fact, she joined the debate at one point, and while most of the people on her side seem to think she did really well, I beg to differ. Let's look at a few clips from that debate.
Matt, that's arguing with me. Are you married?
No, I am single.
Okay. And that's the other thing, and that's what I thought. So you're not a married man who's been addicted to pornography, but I don't think you understand the problem well enough. I think you have not been married, so you don't. So I think that's part of the problem. This is the big problem. I think you as an unmarried man.
So you can tell she's undermining my position because I'm an unmarried man and somehow that's relevant. Now, nobody brought that up. In the first 57 minutes of the discussion we had, nobody brought that up. No one expressed this snobbish attitude that because I'm an unmarried man, that undermines my opinions on this topic. Nobody. Which would make some sense considering that one of the other men I was batting back and forth with in that dialogue, he was also a single man. At least one of them was. I don't preemptively discount what my opponent says based upon their present marital status. What's ironic is that if I were to apply Colleen's line of reasoning, and I were to apply it to her and to the lady she had on her show and the book she promoted, I would have a much stronger case to just dismiss everything they said. Why? Because Vicky Titi, the author of the book, When Your Husband Looks at Pornography, Healing Your Wounded Heart, is a once divorced woman.
So I just want wives to be encouraged. Though my first marriage did not survive,
she has a failed marriage under her belt. Now that's a heck of a lot more relevant. If we're going to apply this kind of thinking to the people involved in this debate, that would be a whole lot more weighty in terms of being able to dismiss what she said or what she wrote in her book. Because having a failed marriage under your belt, that's a lot worse than being single. I could have brought that up, but I didn't because I don't need to. This isn't about a debate between who knows better because whatever their present marital status is. Either what she said aligns with scripture or it doesn't. So I didn't bring it up. I didn't need to. Now, when it comes to Colleen, one of the first things she said on the show was,
I'm not an expert on the topic. And that's why we did the podcast, but I'm not an expert on it. My husband hasn't been addicted to pornography. So I'm not sure that I can really speak to a lot of things, but I do want to say a few things because I know what Matt's arguments are.
Colleen preempted everything else she said by letting everybody know I'm not an expert, which is funny because she's married and has children. If I were going to apply her reasoning to her, I could say, well, then who are you to talk about this? I think maybe you probably shouldn't be able to talk about this because you're not an expert. In fact, you have less of an excuse for not being an expert because you're a married woman and you're still not an expert. I mean, I could have interrupted her right there and dismissed everything she said right at that very moment.
So you're not a married man who's been addicted to pornography, but I'm not an expert on it. My husband hasn't been addicted to pornography.
So hang on. I'm not a husband who is addicted to pornography, and that undermines what I say, but her being married to a husband who isn't a porn addict and never has been, that's irrelevant. See, two can play this game. This snobbish, condescending game of trying to take shots at each other about, oh, what's your present marital status, your expert status, whatever it is. Anyone can play that game, and I would be the one who would win, hands down. But I didn't bother. How did I respond? Are you done? Can I respond?
Obviously, I've stopped, Matt.
Okay, well, I don't want to start talking and then I wind up interrupting you. I don't see, my arguments have been scriptural in nature. Whether I am single or married or widowed is not the point. I never brought up we've had a discussion this whole time. Nobody brought up my marital status and said, well, you're wrong because of that. I didn't bring up Vicky Teague's marital status. I didn't bring up your marital status. So I don't think that has anything to do with that. Unless you can refute the interpretation from scripture, then there's really nothing more else to say after that. See? I didn't mock her. I didn't use her non-expert status against her. I could have, but I didn't. It was enough to remind her that what's at stake is my arguments from scripture and whether they hold water, which she never touched with a 10-foot pole. Now, she did interject later on after I had a small discussion with a man named Chris. Yeah, but the solution
statistics will show that the marital sex will not fill that void in someone who is addicted to pornography.
If you're talking about the artificial need created by the porn addiction, then I would agree with you. Cutting a person off from sex altogether that makes about as much sense as saying that because you discovered a man drinking out of a sewer, you should deny him access to fresh water.
I don't think anybody has posited that, have they?
Yes. Vicky Titi said when you discover your husband has a porn addiction, that you should go on a sexual fast.
Well, I think that's...
Yes, you did. In case you couldn't hear that, Colleen said, that's not what she said.
Well, I think that's...
Yes, you did. Yeah, it's not what she said. It is what Vicky Titi said, actually. But here's the thing. I just demonstrated the silliness of a wife cutting her husband off from having sex with her because he's looking at pornography. Yeah, he's drinking from the sewer, but you don't tell a man who's drinking from the sewer you're not going to cut him off from fresh water just because he really wants to drink out of the sewer. It makes no sense to do that, and it sure as heck doesn't make any sense to say a man should have to go without sex from his wife because he has a porn addiction. And you'll notice Chris immediately balked at that comparison. I don't think anyone has suggested that, have they? Because the comparison is just that good. People immediately see the problem, and the instant reaction is, Well, nobody would suggest such a thing because that's just stupid. And Colleen reacted herself, even saying, no, that's not what you said. But she did, and I pointed that out in the debate. And we're going to get to that in a minute, but one thing really quick first.
Let me step in now. She said that a lot of counselors will recommend that. That's what
yes, that's
said.
exactly what, that's right.
That's what she said. She did not tell women in my audience go on a sexual fast.
Okay, we're going to get to my rebuttal in a second, but what's the point of mentioning that Vicky Titi says a lot of counselors will recommend that? She didn't say it. She just said that a lot of counselors would recommend that. Vicky Titi didn't denounce them. She didn't bring up what a lot of counselors say and tell the listeners, now listen, ladies, that's really bad advice there. If your counselor is suggesting something like this, you should probably find a different counselor. She didn't say anything like that. She brought up what a lot of counselors say as part of her own advice to the listeners of Theology Gals as to what they should do if they discover their husband is addicted to porn. That's why she brought them up in the first place. So to say Vicky herself didn't say it, she just mentioned that counselors say it, is misleading. In fact, it's downright false to say she didn't make the recommendation herself because that's exactly what she did.
That's what she said. She did not tell women in my audience go on a sexual fast.
Oh, no, she did. Wait. Yes, she did. She did. She absolutely did say that. I can read off the quote. 49 minutes, 20 seconds into the episode 22 of Theology Gals, she said, I think that when you first find out that there's pornography, there does need to be a period of a sexual fast. Okay. And you should be doing that with the consultation of a professional therapist. She's personally making the recommendation.
I think that when you first find out that there's pornography, there does need to be a period of a sexual fast, and you should be doing that with the consultation of a professional therapist.
She did not tell women in my audience go on a sexual fast.
There does need to be a period of a sexual fast.
She did not tell women in my audience go on a sexual fast.
There does need to be a period of a sexual fast, and you should be doing that with the consultation of a professional therapist.
She's personally making the recommendation.
Okay, she said with a therapist.
If you watch the debate, I still didn't jump on that and say, hey, I just proved you wrong. I caught you contradicting yourself. You said she didn't say that. I proved that she did. Why don't you respond to that? I kind of just let it go because that was just so obvious what had just happened. So I figured I'd let her go ahead and just make some more points if she wanted, and she did. She brought up impotence in the bedroom due to porn addictions and suggested a sexual fast could help cure that.
What he was saying, the different parts of the brain, one thing that does happen is that a man is addicted to pornography, they get married, and sometimes the man is impotent in his relationship with his wife. And that this is a true thing. And sometimes having a time of a sexual fast is what heals that. And I'm trying to be careful how I say all of this. So and I actually talked, after talking to you, I talked to a couple of people, and they said they did go have a short sexual fast in which they devoted themselves to prayer, and then they came back. And I actually think that that is absolutely biblical. If the couple agrees.
It's wise too.
Right, yeah, if the couple agrees, and that's only a maybe, which means even if they agree, they shouldn't necessarily do it. It's still not necessarily a good decision. Yeah, if the couple agrees. I wish I had asked the question, okay, so if the porn-addicted husband, if he doesn't agree to go on a sexual fast, then what does that mean biblically? What is can they still go on a sexual fast? I mean, what is a Christian wife's obligation in that situation? She wants to go on a sexual fast. He doesn't agree. So what is her obligation? Biblically, she has to continue to have sex with him because he doesn't agree. That's what must happen biblically, but I don't think you'd ever get any of these people to say so flat out. Which is interesting because, see, for me, if the husband wanted to go on a sexual fast and the wife didn't agree, then I have no problem saying the husband can't go on a sexual fast. He is obligated to have sex with his wife if she doesn't agree to go on a sexual fast, even if she looks at porn. I have no problem saying that. I can say that because I apply 1 Corinthians 7 verses 1 through 5 equally to both men and women. But when it comes to holding women accountable in the same way, there's all this hesitation, as you're about to see in this next clip. I mean, is there anybody here who can say, yes, if a husband wants to have sex with his wife, he doesn't want to look at porn, but his wife is frigid, she refuses to have sex with him, then she shares some of the blame. Can any of you guys say that? I can say the opposite. I can say that in the situations you described, Brian, that yeah, the man is 100% it is 100% to blame. Now, can you guys agree with me on the other end that if those conditions aren't met, that you have a frigid wife who is spurning you constantly, that if you then decide to look at porn, that's partly her fault?
I would say that she's responsible for withholding. I would not say that she's responsible for you taking an action upon yourself.
Okay, well, let me ask a question more specifically then. Is she guilty of leaving you vulnerable to temptation to Satan?
Yes, she's guilty. She's guilty of withholding, which yes,
that's not what I said. Is she guilty of leaving you vulnerable to temptation from Satan? That's what 1 Corinthians 7 says. Is that true or isn't it?
Yeah,
would that be what she was guilty of?
I would actually say that...
Did you notice the hesitation there? When I point blank asked him if a wife is guilty of leaving her husband vulnerable to temptation from Satan himself, did you notice how quiet he became? See, if you're not a Christian, this may not mean much to you, but as Christians, we believe in something called the devil, and the devil tempts people, including Christians, to commit sin. And when you have a wife who is persistently refusing to have sex with her husband, which is a pervasive problem in the church today, that means she's guilty of leaving him vulnerable to temptation from the devil himself. That's not a small little sin. That is a pretty vile sin to commit, and it's a grave charge to level at a wife, but it's right there in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 5. Why couldn't my opponent just admit that? Because the subject under dispute was whether frigid wives share the blame when their husbands look at porn, and for this man, that is unacceptable. Notice, I asked him the question, and he dodges, and then I bring him back to the original question, and then silence. I prod him a couple more times, silence. So another man steps in and takes over. Why might that be? Where's this reluctance coming from? Seems pretty clear to me. This man's whole shtick was that a frigid wife is only responsible for the sin of withholding sex from her husband, even though the Bible says that the devil himself is waiting to tempt her husband if she does that. That's his position, but as you saw, he will not say it flat out, because then it would just be obvious. His position is unbiblical, it makes no sense, it is indefensible. Anyway, let's get back to Colleen.
I personally, and I think there's maybe some assumptions going on here, I never would tell a woman to abstain from marital intimacy when her husband doesn't want to. I would never do that, and I don't think that that's what we said in the podcast. And actually, I think it... Okay, go ahead.
I was going to say that's actually what I was going to bring up. The first part of
I'm sorry.
I
have to break in and respond here.
Okay.
Colleen, you may not have said that personally yourself, but Vicky Teague does say that. We read a quote earlier. I still have it on my screen.
Did she say, women, even if your husbands want to have sex, don't do it? Because she did not say that. She said
Yeah, here, go ahead. Keep going. I'll bring up the quote. Yeah, page 121.
Wait. That wasn't on my podcast then, so it's not even up for discussion. That was not on my podcast.
Real quick before I read the quote, that's not up for discussion? Since when? I must have missed the meeting where I agreed that Colleen got to set the rules for what was up for discussion and what isn't allowed for discussion. I mean, it's... but there she was saying that it's not even up for discussion. I guess, if she sensed that I was about to prove that I was right and she was wrong, then it would make sense to try and put some distance between what Vicky Teedy said in her book and what Vicky said on Colleen's show. Because then Colleen could say, well, hey, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the podcast. That was just something that Vicky said in her book. The problem is they had Vicky Teedy on to promote the book. And Colleen personally recommended the listeners to buy the book.
We're going to be talking to Vicky Teedy, who has written a book called When Your Husband is Addicted to Pornography. But it's not just about that. It's about learning to look to the Lord and the healing that the Lord brings when you're going through that. And we already taped it. It's just she has so many wonderful things to say, so I'm excited about that. If you're somebody who's been struggling with this, please go and order the book.
Listen, you promoted the book. This is part of the reason that podcast is a problem.
At least be clear.
I am clear. This is in her book, and it wasn't specifically mentioned on your podcast, but you promoted the book on the podcast. So that makes it relevant. She said, this is Vicky Teague, page 121, When Your Husband is Addicted to Pornography, Healing Your Wounded Heart. She writes, I'm going to offer a few ideas for you and your husband to consider implementing when you are ready to be sexually intimate. Encourage your husband to verbally ask you if you'd like to be sexual with him. This will help you feel respected and will allow you the freedom to say no with honesty and without repercussion. Now, if you want to disavow that, Colleen, you can, but it's a little late now that you've gone ahead and told people to buy this book. I don't know about you, but in my opinion, complete, total devastation. I just proved that the author, Vicky Teedy, the lady Colleen had on her show and whose book she promoted, is telling women to encourage their husbands to ask permission to have sex, specifically so that they feel comfortable saying no when their husbands ask for it. Colleen said they didn't say that on the podcast as if they would never say such a thing, but Vicky Teedy did, and Colleen didn't even know. I knew. That's because I do my homework. If Colleen had informed me of a book that I promoted and I didn't know there was something in it that I would completely reject, I would take whatever video or podcast I had made, I would take it down. I've done that before. It's nothing new to me. You don't have to be happy about it, but that's what your reaction should be. So what was Colleen's reaction?
You know what, Matt? I need to be really honest. I'm having a very difficult time with this discussion. I think you're really disrespectful of me, especially for someone who's about my own children's ages, just the whole tone. So I'm not even sure that I want to continue on talking with you. Sorry.
That's up to you. I haven't complained about your tone or your critical remarks about me personally. I'm happy to have the discussion.
Okay. This started before this. You were rude to me on Facebook, so
See, she and I did spar on Facebook, and we had heated words for each other, and you could call it rude if you want, I guess, but when she came on, I didn't dismiss her. I didn't say, I will not interact with your serious questions on this matter because you were rude. It's such a lame, petty, dare I say it, girly reason not to have to respond to somebody's arguments. The thing is, I wasn't rude to her just then. I wasn't rude to her in the podcast. I wasn't rude to her at all. I was interacting with what she said, and I never brought up that she talked down to me because I was unmarried, even though she did do that in the podcast. I didn't even go there. I didn't preemptively dismiss what she said, or let alone say, you know what, I can't have this discussion with you anymore because you're just so rude. I think everybody else in that hangout could tell this was just some excuse to get away from having to admit her error, which is why, again, after I call her out, silence.
This started before this. You were rude to me on Facebook, so
Yes, you know what? We had a dispute on Facebook, but I have not brought that up. Only you have. I've been trying to answer your questions from what I've said about the Bible and about the contents of the book. I've not said, you know what, Colleen was rude. She talked down to me because of my age or any. I haven't brought that up. This isn't about you and me. So can we just leave that aside?
The other guys can go ahead and talk if they want to respond to what he said.
Well,
And then the discussion went on from there. Despite their initial silence, though, that didn't stop a couple of these guys from praising her to the high heavens later on Facebook. You would think that the moments I just played for you never happened the way they talked about it. How come none of them were talking about those moments of the debate? Maybe because they weren't her most shining moments, maybe? It really seems to me that we have another example of feminism in the church. Women can do no wrong, and if they do wrong, just pretend it never happened. That's one of the reasons I decided to do a full-blown review of this debate, because the reactions have been so bizarre, but illustrative of the fact that the Christian church, it's not being infiltrated by feminists. We are feminists. We teach feminist attitudes and beliefs. We promote women who teach contrary to Scripture, and when it's revealed to us that they do, we don't retract our promotion. We just spurn the man who called us out. It's feminism, and it needs to be confronted. However, this was nonetheless a very good and profitable discussion. Not everyone there disagreed with me on every point.
The thing about Christianity when it comes to the sin of lust, if a woman dresses immodestly, she is sinning, but we don't blame her for the sin of the male looking at her with lust.
I would.
She is guilty of her own. Well, no, she's guilty of her own sin, but he's guilty of his sin. That's what I'm saying. She is guilty of dressing immodestly. That's a sin. Yes.
I don't deny that, but the blame is shared.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's what I'm trying to get to.
That's the thing that's a little frustrating for me is you keep saying she's responsible for this one sin and he's responsible for that one sin. I'm not denying that,
yes.
But the blame is shared.
Yes, and I'm agreeing, and that's kind of what I was going for this specific situation that you're discussing. That it is a shared thing, more often than not. Like we were saying before. I mean, there's some cases where it's often left field. Where Brian was just discussing things where it's like, okay, yeah, that's completely shared, or that's completely the man's end of things.
Yeah.
And again, like if it's a completely and utterly frigid woman who's completely and utterly withholding a man's, then again, I think it would still be a shared thing in that situation as well,
right.
Where it's
right. But just to remind you, that's why I said one of the other things in my video is that people are adverse to even acknowledging that fact. Because then it reduces the high-handed nature of why the husband sinned in that way by looking at porn. Because now you know he didn't do it just by himself. He had somebody else. There was somebody else who was aggravating him to that state wherein he did that. And so I think if you guys agree with me on that, then I think the title of the of this whole hangout has been solved. Are men only at fault? I'd say the answer is no, and I think it's been established. See, for me, this debate was over in less than half an hour. The point of contention had been made. I had at least one of the council members say, yeah, I guess, yeah, frigid wife does share blame when her husband looks at porn. So in my opinion, case closed. But of course, there is at least 8 other people in that hangout who also wanted to take their turn throwing arguments at me, asking me questions and so on. So it went on for much, much longer than that. But I didn't mind because I saw this as a great opportunity. Christian anti-feminists are few and far between, and when it comes to the issue of pornography, as I demonstrated in my first video on this topic, when it comes to a Christian husband who is struggling with porn, who wants to speak up on his own behalf by pointing fingers at his wife, he is shut down swiftly and harshly. In this situation, that wasn't going to happen. In this debate dialogue, that wouldn't happen, and I was going to take full advantage of it. That one guy I quoted earlier about temptation with Satan, he went so far, I'm going to say he engaged in mental gymnastics to try and exculpate frigid wives from having to share the blame for their husband's porn addiction. He went out of his way on multiple occasions to take exception even to the use of the word blame itself.
See, I have a hard time with this, they share the blame, because there's 2 sins.
Why even make the distinction since it doesn't rescue her from blame?
Well, you keep using this word. Hold on, you keep using this word blame, and I don't understand. Are you saying that the man's sin is shared with the woman?
I said she is to blame. If he's the only man, if he's
define
the
your
only
term.
person,
Define what you mean by blame.
Responsibility.
Okay.
He is guilty of sin. She's guilty of sin. And the blame for why he went and committed another sin is shared. I don't know why we have to keep going over this. It seems a pretty simple thing to understand.
But the thing is, if like Brian said,
the problem is that are we responsible for our own actions or not?
Yes, I keep saying that. Yes, you're responsible for yours, and she is responsible
for mine.
Yes, in the specific situation, you want to have sex, she refuses, and you succumb to looking at porn. Yes.
Again, you keep using this word blame, and my problem is that you haven't really defined what you mean by blame. Do you mean that they're sharing responsibility, that the woman is the cause? Yes. No, hold on, I'm not done.
Yeah, he's not done. But I literally defined the word for him earlier. But here he is, asking the question again like he didn't even hear me.
Define what you mean by blame.
Responsibility.
And my problem is that you haven't really defined what you mean by blame. Do you mean that they're sharing responsibility, that the woman is the cause? Yes. No, hold on, I'm not done. And you haven't really, you keep using this very vague term blame. And so that's where I think people are having issues, because they hear blame and they immediately think, okay, so we're shifting blame now.
If all they hear is the word blame, then they're not listening. I keep saying shares the blame, which means both are to blame. They should not be. If anyone is still confused about it, they should not be. Let me ask a question here. If these men were in a store and there is a child being dragged along by his parents, and this child is a spoiled child, he's screaming at his parents, knocking items off the shelf, creating a mess, would these men sit there and would they witness such behavior and think, well, you know what? The child is responsible for the sin of being disrespectful and so on. The parents are responsible for raising the child wrong. But what do you mean when you say the parents share the blame when their child knocked items off the shelf? I don't understand what you mean. What do you mean by this word blame? There would be no confusion whatsoever. The only reason there's confusion here is because I was pointing to a wife and saying she was at fault if her husband sins. That's the only reason why. Outside of this context, in the Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory movie, when they were singing a song about the one child who was spoiled, and who was the one to blame? The mother and the father. I don't think anybody who watched that movie was like, what do you mean the mother and the father are to blame? I mean, the child has the responsibility for what the child does, and the parents are responsible for raising them wrong, but what do you mean the parents are to blame? I don't understand. What do you mean by this term blame? That would never be the reaction anybody would have to that. But it only happens here. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Oh, this pastor named Justin came in, and he basically just started throwing red meat in front of my opponents. I mean, he came in and he started preaching and talking really loudly, and I think basically he was saying what I think some of the more angered people on Facebook only have the guts to say behind their keyboard. He was there being their mouthpiece and trumpeting their cause. For example, he accused me of trying to justify sinful sexual behavior, even though I refuted it many times over, he wouldn't let it go. Watch for yourself.
What you're trying to do is you're trying to justify sexual acts and sexual congress between married couples right this very moment, sir. And I mean this with all due respect. You need to understand that you're trying to justify sexual immorality by saying, well, no man should have to when they're married. They shouldn't ever have to wait. The problem is you're justifying that you don't have to wait now.
Now, I assumed that maybe he was repeating himself because he just didn't know. Maybe he hadn't heard that portion of the debate where I said, yeah, it's not okay for a husband to look at pornography. I figured maybe he just didn't hear that part, and that's why he kept repeating the charge. But it turns out I was wrong. But the thing is, I kept saying over and over, and every man in this room can testify to this. I didn't trying to justify anything. I specifically gone out of my way to deny that I would never say that a man is innocent of sin, of the sin of looking at pornography, for example. Even if he looks at it, he is still guilty of that sin. I said the blame is shared. I made that distinction many, many, many times. And if you go and re-listen to this later, you will hear me say that over and over again. Oh, well then I don't accept your heated exhortation that I'm trying to justify sinful behavior.
And when I try to justify my sexual sin because my wife didn't meet my needs, and when they fail, we don't just try to justify it and say, well, she should have done this, and try to look like, well, now I have the right for sexual immorality.
Oh, sure. Well, again, no, I would never suggest he ever had a right. If the husband accepts that he sinned, he's looking at pornography, of course he's in sin.
Okay. What I see you doing is justifying the adultery, the lust of the eyes, and all these things. And I resent that anybody would try to justify, well, we have the right, or it's understandable that somebody runs out and looks at pornography or looks with lust. Are you going to justify the very act of adultery or homosexuality or bestiality, or are you going to justify child pornography or even child rape and sex? How can you justify one without justifying all of them?
I wouldn't this may be just a problem because this is a new conversation, but I've never ever justified. I've never said anybody is innocent of the sin. They are not justified. Pointing out that the blame is shared is not justifying it. So there were times when it was pretty frustrating to talk to this guy. But yet again, I kept myself restrained, waiting for a moment to break in. And at one point, I got to interact with him with one of his proposed scenarios where you've got a wife who is grieving and a husband who wants sex. What do you do? And if you say if you pose the question to me, what about a husband and a wife who are going through grieving? And let's say the husband feels like he needs sex, but his wife is still grieving.
Okay.
I agree. That's a tough call to make. But you've got one thing. You've got two things on one end. If you feel that if the need is great enough that you feel like you might lust after other women because the temptation is strong, you're starting to lose self-control because you're being deprived. So you feel like maybe you will look at pornography. You may watch something that's not technically pornography. That's just a PG-13 R-rated movie. Okay. At that point, you have to choose between the two. And I think it would be. I don't think it's inappropriate to expect a wife to say that if a husband says that he's at the end of his rope and that he's afraid he is going to do those things, that she should try to accommodate him. I think that would be a fair thing for a husband to ask. I don't think it would be selfish for him to ask. And but again, yeah, it's a tough call.
Well, okay, and it is a tough call in some cases. I guess you could say that.
Did Pastor Justin sound just now like he thought I was completely off my rocker with that response? Yeah, he's only halfway conceding my point, but he wasn't coming down on me with like a ton of bricks like he was before. It's almost as if I gave a reasonable answer that he wasn't expecting, maybe? I don't know, but I hope it did strike some people that I was able to interact with his scenario and my response wasn't, oh, yeah, the husband's just got to tough it out. He's got to go without sex if his wife's grieving. I think, I hope it did strike some people that I could demonstrate, no, it's not necessarily the right decision to tell the husband he just has to go without sex. I hope that got into people's minds and they're like, I didn't think of it like that before. And maybe they'll think of other situations which is most of the time the wife is not grieving, but she's still trying to give some excuse for not having sex with her husband. If grieving is one of those areas where even then, the husband is not automatically forbidden from having sex. What about all those other situations, like where a wife gives some silly, stupid excuse that I can't have sex with you because I haven't showered, or I have a headache, something stupid like that? Maybe that interaction got into their minds. Maybe they're going to start changing their minds when they start reflecting upon that. That was my main goal. That's my priority. It's not eviscerating my opponents, even if they misbehave themselves. My priority is to hopefully change their minds and hopefully edify other Christians in the process. And I like to think that I accomplished that because John Wilkinson, he posted this episode later and he said this episode was heard throughout the internet. I don't know what that means, but I like to think that means something good, as in a lot of people listened to it. So that's what I hope happened. Now, mine was not a flawless performance. There's a couple of mistakes I made. I'll point them out for you here in case you go and listen to it. There was one point where I forgot who I was talking to.
But Paul, but your whole argument is 1 Corinthians 7, 1-5, and Paul himself says that it's okay to take a short break and then come back. Where did Colleen just now say that it's...
I'm responding to the gentleman who just spoke. Yeah, the man who spoke just now, or just then, that was the same man who was talking to me right at that moment. For some reason, I didn't get it. I didn't catch on to that, but okay. There was another point where a man gave me his general idea of the entire book of 1 Corinthians, and I agreed with him, but if you watch the debate, I said, I disagree with him. I don't agree with the general gist of that about the letter, the purpose of the letter to the Corinthians. I meant to say I don't disagree with him because I used that phrase, don't disagree, a couple times in the debate, but for some reason, I guess it just came out wrong. So, yeah, so if you see those parts of the debate, those are mistakes, I admit them. Mine is not a flawless performance, but that's okay. It was a great debate overall, and I hope you guys go and watch it. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this review, and I hope you enjoy the debate when you see it. Like and subscribe, and I can't wait to see you again on the Prince Asbel channel.